In this video, we'll learn about hooks. Now, in the last video, we saw that Feathers.js services can be used to implement data storage, data modification, essentially interact with all types of things. And if we wanted to, we could build our whole application with services. However, there are certain things that we need to reuse throughout our application, and it wouldn't make sense to just implement in one service. And this is where hooks can come into play. Now, hooks are small middleware functions that can be executed before, after, or on error of any given service method. So the way to think about this is for any given service method, we can have various hooks that will get called along the way. So for the find method of this given service, we can first call our hook that to make sure that they're logged in. And then we can call another hook to make sure that they're an admin. And if both of those are satisfied, we'll allow them to search in the database. We can also have after hooks. So if you have something like a user service where you want to remove the user's passwords from the user entity before returning it to the client, you can have a hook that automatically removes certain fields from the outgoing data. And as I mentioned, these hooks are reusable, so they're just small functions. So instead of having to write that code over and over again, we can define one hook and then bring it in and use it in multiple service methods in multiple different hooks. Now, to see an example of that, here we just have a basic hook called created@. Now, you'll see that the hook gets access to the context. We'll talk more about the context in a second. But particularly, the thing that we care about in methods like create or update is data. So data on the context is the actual thing that we'll be either creating or updating. And so in the case of create, we can add a created@ property on data, set it to the current date, and then we'll return the context. And what this will do is any data that passes through this hook is going to get a new property on it called created@. And now, for instance, in our messages service, we could register this hook in the before create. And now before any message is created, it's automatically going to add that created@ date to it. Now, you'll see as you start to write hooks that these things are actually very reusable, and we can technically reuse this hook, but actually modify a different property name depending on where that hook was run. So we can see it's pretty much the same hook here, but it now is a function which you can invoke with a particular property name that you'd like to set. And it's just setting the current date on that property name. So now we can reuse this hook for created@. Just like before, so when a particular message is created, we'll set the created@ method. And we also have our updated@. So whenever a message is updated, we'll set the updated@ property on that given message. So you can see here how hooks are very reusable. And once you've defined them, you can use them in many different ways, and they become actually very useful. Now, let's talk a bit more about this context object. Now, context has quite a few properties on it. Some of them are read-only and some of them are writable. In terms of read-only properties, you have access to app. This is our Feathers application. So once you say context.app, you have access to all of your Feathers application, including .services, .get, etc. You can do context.service to access a particular service within your application. Context.path, which is the name of the service. Context.method to see what type of method is being called. Is it the find one or the find all? And the hook type. So is it before, after, or on error? Now, this becomes very powerful because within hooks, you can call other services. You can have a hook that does something custom based on the path or based on the method. And so all of these things are very useful from within a hook. There are writable properties, and this is how you would actually modify an outgoing request or an incoming data in terms of create or update. Context.params is going to include the query. So this is anything that was on the query string for a RESTful request. It'll also include provider. So if you want to do something specific, if this data is coming across on a particular transport, you can check that property. You have context.id if you're accessing one individual item with the get, remove, or the update method. We showed in our example, context.data is the actual data that was sent by the user when they're either creating, updating, or patching a given item. You have context.error, so you can actually throw an error. And context.result will be the result that actually gets sent back to the client. And this you have access to in any of the after hooks. So here we can see we have access to many different things inside of our hooks, which actually allows us to create very powerful hooks, which can do pretty much anything we would want them to. Now, as I mentioned, these hooks can be registered in many different places. So typically within the generated application, you'll see for any given service, the before, the after, and the error that you can tap into. So for any given method name, you can specify your hooks in here, and those hooks will get called when any one of these methods are called. Now, let's go ahead and generate a hook so we can see how all of this works. Okay, now we will generate a hook using the feathers generator. Now you could of course create these hooks yourself. They're simply functions that will get called and you can import them in. But the feathers generator is very convenient in that it puts all of your hooks in the same place and makes things more consistent. So I'm going to say feathers generate hook. We can then name our hook. Now for this hook, we're going to call it process message. And so we're going to create a simple hook that looks at the incoming data whenever a user is creating a message and then does some validation. It'll make sure that it has a text property. It'll make sure that it is of a particular length. And then it will also automatically add a created at timestamp on it. So let's call it process message. What kind of a hook should it be? In this case, we're going to do a before hook because we want to call this hook before a message is created. And what services should this hook be for? Now we could set this as application wide, and that means it would be called before a particular method throughout our application. Now we don't want that. We just want it to be a before hook in messages. So I'll select that. And then what methods should this hook be for? In this case, I just want it for the create method. If I hit enter, we can see that it generated the process message hook in the hooks directory, and then it updated messages.hooks to actually use that hook. So let's take a look. If we look now in the hooks directory, we can see here's our process message hook. It's totally empty. And totally basic. It just returns the context for now. And if we look in our services and we look at messages, we can see that the process message hook automatically got required in, and it automatically got added there on the create method. So the process message hook will get called before any message is created. Now let's go ahead and add our custom logic. First thing we'll do is we will destructure data from the context. And remember, data is the incoming data, particularly for this hook because it is a before create hook. So this is the data that the client is sending to the server. Now, first we'll do some basic validation, and we'll just say if there is no text property on the data, we're going to throw an error. We'll say a message must have text. And this is another thing to note about hooks. If a hook throws an error, it will instantly stop. Any other hooks that we're going to get called afterwards won't get called, and it will actually return this error to the client. So this is one way of just immediately jumping out of a hook when something has happened. So after we've done that validation, if the error doesn't get thrown, we also want to make sure that the text is of a particular length. And we're also going to add the user ID of the user that created that message to the incoming message. So first thing we'll do is destructure the user from the params. So we'll say context.params. And particularly the way authentication works is because we have auth set up, all incoming requests that are authorized will actually have user data on the params object. So we have the user, and then we'll do our text validation. So we'll say text equals data.text.substring. And we're just going to make sure that it's no longer than 400 characters long. And so this will essentially just, if it was longer than 400 characters, it'll just chop off the rest. And this is all that we're going to be putting in our database. Now, the last thing we'll do is we'll overwrite context.data. So if you remember, data, context.data is the thing that the client sent us. And by overwriting it, we're going to be overwriting what actually will get inserted into the database. So here I'll say context.data. We're going to pass in this updated text property. So that's the truncated text. We're going to create a user ID property, and that's going to be equal to user._ID. And we'll also create a created at property, and that's just going to be equal to a new date, and we'll get the current time. Awesome. Now I mentioned it, but the reason we're adding the user ID here is so that we can, that way we can associate a particular message with the user that created it. And by putting the user ID here on the server side, there's no way that a client could attempt to create a message that belongs to some other user. They can only create messages that belong to them. Now, that's all we need to do in this hook. And of course, at the bottom of every hook, you need to return the context. And because this is a before create hook, before a message is created, all of these things will be checked, all of these things will be updated, and ultimately this is what's going to get inserted into the database when a new message is created. Now let's actually create another hook. So we'll create a hook for the outgoing messages. So anytime we request messages from our server, we want to automatically populate the user data. So we'll go back to the terminal and generate another hook. In this case, we'll call it populate user. We want this to be an after hook because this should get called after we have retrieved messages from the database. And in this case, we're going to do messages again. And we want to do after all. So after any one of these methods are called, we're actually going to populate the user information. Awesome. And if we take a look at messages.hooks, we can see that it automatically got added here after all, and it's bringing it in from the hooks directory. And if we look in the hooks directory, we now have another hook called populate user. And now, as I mentioned, what we're going to do in here is for any outgoing message, we will automatically put the user data onto that message because when a message was created, we did add the user ID. So we can use the user ID to request the given user from the user service and attach it to every single outgoing message. So first thing we'll do is destructure all of the things that we'll need from the context. So we'll grab the app, we'll grab the method, result, and params, all from context. And then we'll create an add user function. So essentially this function will take in a message. So we'll say async message. We're going to take in the message. And then what we need to do is query the user service for the user of the given message, and then we'll attach it. So I'll say user is going to be await app.service users.get, and we want to pass in the ID for the given user, and that comes from message.userID. And then we'll forward any params that were passed in the request, and that should give us back the user. And now what we'll do here is we're going to return the message spread, so it'll have all of the properties of the message, including the user. So now we've essentially just attached a user property to that message. Now we'll have some custom logic to figure out what type of a hook we're in. So if this is a find hook, then that means we actually have multiple messages that we need to attach the user to. But if it's just one, we only need to attach the user to one message. So we'll say if method is equal to find, then we'll need to override the data in the resulting context. So we'll say result.data equals await promise.all, and we're going to pass in result.data.map add user. So if this was a find method, result.data is going to be an array of all of the messages, and we essentially want to map over each message and add the user object to that message. Awesome. Now the other case is if the method is just searching for one particular message. So it's not a find all, it's just like a get. So in this case, we'll say context.result equals await add user with result. So if you remember, result is the outgoing data. And so in the case of just a get, that's going to be just one single message. And so here we're just passing in one message, which will add the user information to it. We can see this is complaining about a possible race condition. I know that we are using async await, and there isn't really a race condition, so I'm actually just going to add an ESLint ignore up at the top here. Awesome. And so that's it for the populate user hook. Now, again, what this will do is anytime there's outgoing messages, so a client has requested all of the messages from the server, or a message was just created and we're sending that out to all of our socket connections, essentially what we'll do is we're going to add the user property to the message, so that way when we're viewing the messages on the front end, we instantly have all of the user information for that given message.